welcome back to Gen Z Bible class. This is a very special class today because we are finishing the book of Genesis. And we're at chapter 50 where things end up here in this, all the things that we've been looking at in the stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Noah and the ark, and the Genesis account of creation. This book, as we said, has so many important things in it when it comes to formulating our understanding of what a Christian worldview is. Some of the most foundational truths we find here. And we're going to find a few more of those, I think, here. Principles that are timeless in the story that this part of the book of Genesis, we're going to look at today, where everything kind of ends up. Well, if you'll remember, we have, the last time we were looking at what happened when Joseph gets word that his father Jacob is about to pass away. They probably weren't living right next door to each other, I think we can assume, because Joseph still had his responsibilities to the court, to the government in Egypt. And we also know that the Egyptians weren't too fond of foreigners. They didn't really like to hang out too much with these Canaanites, but they had high respect for them, and I think that's one of the things we're going to see today as we wind up the book. Well, what happened the last time, as I said, Joseph got wind of the fact that his father was about to pass away, and so if you'll recall, he had packed up his chariot, and he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and went to see his father. And his father, of course, pronounces this blessing upon his two sons. He adopts them as his own sons, which was, quite a touching story. But the last thing that Jacob asks for, he has a dying request. This is kind of a common scenario when somebody is at their deathbed and they ask for just one more thing, and this is exactly what happens with Jacob, and we read about that. And this is actually the last verse of chapter 49 in verse 29. Then he gave them these instructions: I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite. So a couple of things here. One is that Jacob has a hope for the future. I'm going to die, but this isn't going to be the end of me, and he's looking forward to joining his fathers, as he said. And also, he makes reference to this field that his father Abraham, and I don't know if you remember that part of the story, but Abraham was living in the land of Canaan, and he didn't actually own any of the land. And his wife Sarah dies, and he has to purchase a place to bury her. And the place that he bought is still in the family trust, and this is exactly where Jacob requests to be buried. So, and we have to keep in mind the fact that he isn't very near there at this point. They're in Egypt, and they had been there for quite a few years now by the time that Jacob is ready to pass away. So now we move on down to the very first verse in Genesis chapter 50, where it says that Joseph threw himself on his father and wept over him and kissed him. And then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father, so the physicians embalmed him. Well, you can just imagine what a bittersweet experience this must have been. I'm sure that Joseph was very pleased with the fact that he was able to meet his father, and I know Jacob was extremely pleased to be able to meet his son. Just before he met him, he was about ready to die then. He was so discouraged, and when he hears that his son is still alive, he kind of perks back up again and lives a number of years more in the comfort of and protection of his son Joseph there in the land of Egypt. So this is obviously a very emotional time for Joseph, and he expresses it. But it also commands his physicians to embalm the body of Jacob. Now this would bring up a few questions, I guess, because these days we don't embalm people. We're not in the habit of it, but in Egypt, they believed that you had to go through this embalming ritual in order for you to enjoy an afterlife. And, this was all part of their religious system. So we asked the question, why is it that Joseph, who really wasn't Egyptian, why did he have his father embalmed? I think, my theory is that he didn't really buy into this whole notion that it has anything to do with Jacob's eternal security. We just read about how he said on his dying bed that he's about to be gathered to his people, and I don't think Jacob thought that he was going to get there by being embalmed. But I think Joseph is a pretty practical guy, and he's thinking, I know that my father requested that he be buried in Canaan. Now that's a few miles down the road. I mean, this is a long journey. And so probably it would be helpful for them to take the 40 days. This whole process of embalming takes 40 days. And this would be handy in this whole process of moving him down to Canaan. So I don't know, this is just kind of my own theory. I'm not real sure. But something happens now that's really very, very interesting to me. And it talks about the fact that the Egyptians, not just Jacob's family, but the Egyptians, engaged in a 70-day mourning for the father of Joseph, for Jacob. And I think what we're going to see here is that this is really pretty amazing, that this shepherd from this faraway land, and that culturally he didn't really fit into the Egyptian idea of somebody that would be given honor to, and yet they bend over backwards, not just Jacob's family, but all of the dignitaries and all of the head people in Egypt had taken. This became like a national day of mourning in Egypt itself. And that's pretty fascinating. So the next thing we find out is that Joseph goes to Pharaoh and he comes to him with a request. So Joseph went up in verse 7 to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court and all the dignitaries of Egypt, beside all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers, and those belonging to his father's household. So it wasn't just the family. Typically in a funeral, you'll have, of course we do it in cars now, everybody follows the hearse that drives down the road to the cemetery, and it's usually family members and close friends that are involved. But this is really pretty amazing that all of these dignitaries and all of the court of Pharaoh decide to go along on this trip. And this wasn't just some afternoon jaunt, out in the wilderness. This was a very serious and long trip. The fact that they were willing to do so, I think, tells us a number of things. One is that they had such tremendous amount of respect for Joseph. Now, these were people that by this time had known Joseph and had seen everything that God had done through him. So I think that they had a lot of respect for him. And of course, the whole miracle of his predicting, the famine and the good time and then the time of famine, and how it set, really was the salvation of the whole country. So they really appreciated it. And it really impresses me with the fact that they were willing to, hop on their horses or donkeys or whatever, or maybe some of them had to walk all the way down to Canaan, or I should say up to Canaan, and observe this time of mourning. There was also, once they reach Canaan, the land of Canaan, they had another time of mourning, and this was by Jacob's family. There was a 7-day period of mourning that is still practiced amongst Jewish people today. That was more of a Jewish custom. It's called the Shiva, the 7 days of mourning after someone passes away. But the other thing, and I would just love to have seen, the Canaanites, as this procession comes, back from Egypt and marches through their land. Now, I'm sure many people, I'm not sure how many years it was that Jacob lived in Egypt, but it was a number of years. So many people maybe have forgotten all about Jacob, or maybe some of them kept contact and knew that he went off to Egypt, and maybe didn't know if he was dead or alive. But they must have been amazed when they see all of Jacob's sons come back with all of these Egyptian, higher ups, all of these Egyptian rulers and leaders and members of Pharaoh's court. It must have been something that they never forgot. It's also interesting how this is almost like a preview of what's going to happen about 400 years later, when once again the Israelites leave Egypt in a great procession. And of course this is getting into the whole book of Exodus, which is the next book that follows the book of Genesis. Well, they end up burying him, and this causes such a commotion in Canaan that they actually renamed the place where all of this happened, and they renamed it to, they called it Abel Mizraim, which means mourning of the Egyptians. In other words, this is where the Egyptians expressed their sorrow at the loss of Jacob. So it was quite a history-making event, just this procession that went down to bury Jacob. Well, once all of this is said and done, of course, Joseph will return home. He will resume his duties as leader in the courts of Pharaoh. But something kind of raises its ugly head once again, and it's the guilt of all of Joseph's brothers. You'll remember that when they met Joseph initially and they found out that it was him, they feared for their lives because of the way they had treated him. And they thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be terrible. He's going to make us all slaves or kill us. And they were just living in such fear, and they had such guilt because they knew what they had intended to do. Fortunately, they didn't kill him. Was on their hearts. And by this time they had repented and they were sorry they did it. But now they're thinking Jacob is dead. And they might have been thinking back to the story of something that happened with Jacob, where, if you'll recall, he had tricked his father, Isaac, into giving him his brother's birthright and then his inheritance. And as a result, Esau swore that he would kill Jacob, but he wouldn't do it until his father Isaac died. And this, of course, gets into the whole story about how Jacob had to flee, and he goes and finds his wife, and this whole part of God moving the plan ahead through these difficult circumstances. But I think the same thing must have occurred to these brothers now. Now that our father Jacob is dead, what is to prevent Joseph from seeking revenge on the things that we had done to him? And we get the answer to that in verse 19. And here Joseph responds to their worry and to their concern by saying, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. And I'm sure that was a big relief to them. They went from almost starvation, as back in the land of Canaan, when the crops all failed. And now, within just a few short years, because of the good graces of their brother Joseph and the position that God had put him in, they were doing very well. We read last week that they had prospered in the midst of all this difficulty. God had put them in a really great place where they could flourish and grow as a family. And they actually got to be, back in the day they would call it eating at the king's table. So he would provide whatever they needed, whatever they couldn't provide for themselves. And this just reminds us once again of the character of Joseph. He was willing to forgive because he knew that something much greater was being accomplished. I think there's probably a spiritual analogy there too. You know, that Jesus was willing to forgive those who hung him on the cross because it accomplished a much greater purpose, and that was the forgiveness of the sins of those very same people and of you and me. So we're very grateful for what Jesus did. And it's interesting to see how Joseph, I think we kind of drew some parallels between the life of Joseph and the life of Jesus earlier. And this is the neat thing about the Bible is God has composed it in such a way that you can see almost like two stories in one in all of these different occurrences. Well, where do we end? So now Joseph has returned, he's forgiven his brothers, and they're pretty much set for the rest of their lives. And now we come to the end of Joseph's life, and this is how the chapter ends. And Joseph has a request very similar to the request that Jacob had, his father. And we read about that in verse 24. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land. He promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So one of the things that we learn about Joseph is even though he spent most of his life in Egypt, he never forgot his childhood days, and he never forgot this promise that he learned about from his father Jacob. The promise that was given to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and now passed on down to Joseph. This was still important to him. And so he assured his brothers. Now by this time, tells us that he's 110 years old when he dies. I'm wondering how old the brothers were. He was, of course, the youngest brother, so they would have been older than him. And maybe when it refers to his brothers here, it could just be referring to his nieces or his nephews. I'm not real sure. It doesn't really matter, but the point is that he is encouraging them to remember the promises that were made to their ancestors, that they will one day return to the land. Now, as Joseph was speaking that, I'm wondering if he realized it was going to be 400 years. Technically, he might have known, because this was a specific prophecy that was made to his great-grandfather, Abraham. His great-grandfather, Abraham. God told him specifically that your descendants will live in Egypt for 400 years. So maybe Joseph had that in mind, or maybe he just sort of forgot that little detail. I'm not real sure. But the point is, it's so heavily on his heart that he encourages the rest of his family that there will come a time when you will go back and God will fulfill his promise. And then finally he makes one more request, which is again very similar to the request of his father in verse 25. And Joseph made the Israelites swear on oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And that's the end of the story. That's the end of the chapter right there, with the death of Joseph. But isn't it interesting that he wouldn't have been satisfied just to stay there or to have his body remain in Egypt? It was so important to him that he himself joined his brothers, or at least his body, in Canaan, back in Canaan. And it's also interesting, while he had himself he was embalmed. Now, I don't know, I'm sure he didn't think that was necessary for his eternal salvation, but he was Egyptian, culturally and in every way he was Egyptian, and certainly to honor the beliefs and the culture of the Egyptians, he wouldn't have minded being embalmed. I mean, it doesn't do you really much good, because it's not like it's going to make you live any longer. But he didn't believe that. But again, it does come in handy, given the fact that he's going to be in Egypt in a tomb for 400 years. And if he hadn't been embalmed, just one of those practical things, I don't know how much it would have been left of him to bring back. But we see when you get to the book of Exodus that when the Israelites left Egypt, one of the things they did is they packed up the remains of Joseph and they brought him with them, and buried him there in that land. Well, what is the lesson that we have in this particular story, in these events here as we come to the end of the book of Genesis? I think the main theme is that Jacob and Joseph had their priorities right. I mean, it would have been really easy for Joseph especially to say, man, I hit the big time when I came to Egypt, because here I am in charge. I have a palace, and I have all these servants. I have as much money as I could ever imagine, and that this defines my life. But he didn't see that as being the thing that defined his life. He thought it was much more important, just as his father Jacob did, because Jacob experienced the same thing. These retirement years for Jacob were pretty sweet, and yet he was not satisfied either to be buried in Egypt. He wanted to be taken back to the land of Canaan, to this promised land that God had said would become his. So both Joseph and Jacob have the same goal in mind. And I think the fact that they were willing to wait is another lesson that we can appreciate as Christians, because God has made us a lot of promises. Now, many of these promises that God has made to us are with us day by day, and we can count on them to be true, that he would give us peace, that he would provide for us, that he would give us our daily bread. All of these things are things that we're very much aware of day by day. But many of the things that we look forward to as Christians are in the future. And just like Joseph had to wait 400 years, we as the church have been waiting for 2,000 years. And a lot of people, will criticize and say, well, Jesus said he's coming back, but it's been 2,000 years, and, I just don't think it's going to happen. Well, it will happen. And one of the reasons we have this long period of waiting is so that many, many more people can be born and receive God's forgiveness and become part of his kingdom. And that's why we call this the church age. So I think there is a real lesson in how we see Jacob and Joseph approach their final days, in like their dying request was all focused on these promises that God had made to them. And really, as Christians, that should be our focal point as well. Not to worry about our immediate circumstances, or whether we got enough money or not, or whether we have security, financial security, but that we are secure in Christ, and that our goal, the land that we are looking for, is really not here in our own Egypt, our version of Egypt, but it's waiting for us. And God promised that he would take us there, and so we know that is, shall I use the term, money in the bank? It's something that we can count on, and as a result, when we look to our future, we have peace. So, we just ended the book of Genesis. And what do we do next? Well, to be honest with you, I'm going to take some time. Right now, as I'm recording this, we're just stepping into summer, and I think I'm going to be taking a number of weeks off and take some time to pray about Gen Z Bible class, as we've enjoyed these 66 weeks of looking at the Bible, and to think a little bit about, maybe tweaking it a little bit, making some improvements, changing the format a little bit. but just waiting on God to get His direction. So I want to say thank you to those of you who have been faithfully listening, to those of you who have subscribed, and if once I can figure out technically how to do it, I can let the subscribers know when we'll come up with some new content. So again, thank you, and God bless every one of you. And I hope, I'm not sure what form it will be in, but that you'll be able to join us again on Gen Z Bible Class.